Hi, everybody. Welcome to Read Science, where we like to invite popular science book authors to talk about how they communicate science to the general public, and, of course, about the topics in their book. I'm joined today by my co-host, Jeff Schomeyer, as always, and by our guest, Steve Gullans, Dr. Steve Gullans. Why don't you say hi before I read your bio?
Hi, Joanne. Hi, Jeff. How are you doing today?
Great. We're so glad you could be on with us. Now, today we will be talking with Steve about the book he co-authored with Juan Enriquez called Evolving Ourselves. And it says how unnatural selection and non-random mutation are changing life on Earth. And I got to pull up your bio here. It's never easy here to find everything online. Of course you disappeared. Here we go. Steve Gullans, PhD, is a venture capitalist, scientist, and entrepreneur. He found Excel Venture Management to work with entrepreneurs developing technology for medicine, energy, agriculture, and social networking. For 18 years, Dr. Gullans was a professor at Harvard Medical School, applying cutting-edge technologies to understanding diseases such as cancer, ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's. His discoveries have led to the founding of several biotech companies. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and has published more than 130 scientific papers in journals such as Nature, PNAS, and the New England Journal of Medicine. Welcome to Steve. I'm really looking forward to talking about the content of the book here today. If you are out in the audience and you have a question, feel free to type it in and we will make sure to pull it up and get an answer for you. Jeff, why don't you throw out the first question?
Okay. Thanks for joining us, Steve. There are so many things to talk about in this book. I had trouble figuring out where to start, so I thought I'd see if I could find a high-level question, and there are two that came to mind. We'll get to the other one. But what I was thinking was when I was young, and that's been a long time, obviously, the big question about evolution, the big question of biology was all about nature versus nurture. And we thought that that was the fundamental question that would answer everything. And we were real clear at the time that every human trait we could imagine was either determined by a particular gene that would be identified in the next year or two, or by the environment that we grew up in. Now the question, that question hardly seems relevant anymore. Events have left it behind. So, what happened?
What happened? It's an interesting evolution in terms of the field and the terminology. We actually have a vignette in the book about E.O. Wilson and James Watson, who discovered the structure of DNA, where we talk about the nurture versus nature debate. And it really came down to the fact that the last century, the 20th century, in the field of biology was dominated by DNA. It was all molecular, all unitary, single gene events. And we wanted to understand all of human traits and all of biology, frankly, at the level of just DNA. And during this time, the environment, or nurture, was relegated to a relatively minor role in the eyes of the leading biologists in the field. So someone like E.O. Wilson, who actually lives in the natural world in terms of what he describes, appreciated how powerful and important the environment is, but it hadn't been built into the context of our current dialogue. The book takes it up from that point and really says what's happened over the last dozen years as we conquered the human genome and all the other genomics is we actually didn't identify the basis of all inheritance and all the phenomena we see in everyday life as being genetic. In fact, genetic genes can describe in absolute detail a small subset of things like some cancers or some Alzheimer's genes, etc. But by and large, the environment is an extraordinarily powerful agent. And just in the last dozen years, we've really begun to understand how these two things interact. They're interfold with each other. So it's really one embedded concept that they work together generation by generation to ensure that all species are born into a world with the best traits possible.
Well, this is a good way to zero in on my other question and start to scope it down a little bit. But the picture that came to mind was an episode I saw of of a silly, I don't know, world's best home videos sorts of thing. And this wasn't that long after the public became aware of electron microscopy. And the popular television programs loved showing examples of the little tiny animals that are crawling on our eyelids and things in order to get the audience to go, ew. But what I wanted to recap, and I don't know if I can get the orders of magnitude right, is where is the edge of the human body, and what do you want to count in the human body? We have the things that we call the human cells. How many of those are there? And then there's 10 times as many of these things that are bacteria, right? And then there are 10 times as many of those, or some number, of virus. It's like, and now you've included all of these because they all form a thing.
Right.
Yeah.
A couple of thoughts around this. We're getting more complex, and the world's getting more complex as the science gets more sophisticated with new tools and ways of looking at it. What we've discovered in the last couple of decades is that humans are, one of the concepts in the book is humans are all born with not just a DNA genome, but with something we call a hologenome that we borrowed from the Rosenbergs in the field of ecology, which means you really have 4 genomes you're born with. One is your DNA, which is frankly very boring. It doesn't change very much. It keeps us alive. It allows us to reproduce and survive in most settings around the globe. But you have 3 other genomes. One's your epigenome, which we can talk about in more detail, the on and off switches that regulate DNA, then your microbiome and your virome. In composite, these represent the inherited universe of genomics for every individual plant or animal. And as we look at how they interact, we begin to see a very sophisticated environment that says the human being is not just the human cells and the human DNA, but it's the interaction between ourselves and these other microbial events around us. And when you say, where does it end? It's really a matter of what the context is. If it's about inheritance, then it really, in terms of what we pass on, it's those 4 genomes that get passed on. If it's in terms of how we influence others around us, it's actually a greater universe because we can have some actions at a distance. And I've worked a lot in the social networking sphere. There are things we can do, and even pheromones and things at a distance you can smell or watch or see. We undoubtedly, through these environmentally sensitive genomes, are taking cues from everybody around us, how to behave, how to live, and how to grow up.
I'm thinking about that for a little bit.
So it's complicated, but it doesn't, in general, we are all looking at a universe of ourselves that is becoming fundamentally known at the level of identifying molecular mechanisms by which health and wellness occur. So the things that your doctor tells you, eat vegetables, live a healthy life in all the ways we're told, are not fiction, but in fact we're figuring out how these work in specific detail so that we can understand what truly is good and what truly is bad. Most bacteria are good, but we have this mindset that we got to kill them. But now we're starting to measure them, and we will actually move to probiotics that will be designed with the correct bacteria to keep you healthy.
Well, and the whole thing, the whole consideration of moving beyond just the nuclear genome into the epigenetics and the microbiome and then the virome, all of that interaction would be less interesting if it weren't for the discovery of the epigenetic effects relatively recently, and I think we'll be getting to that. But you remind me that I wrote down a quotation from about halfway through the book where you wrote, "Sex turns out to be really complicated," and that was true. But that made me think, it seems from the book that it turns out that pretty much everything human is really complicated. It's so much more than we thought it was 50 years ago.
It is so much more. I mean, if you look at, let's just take sex and reproduction as an example. In Darwin's day, there was one way to have babies. It was very well known and very well practiced. But that also, since then, we've actually had more than a dozen ways to reproduce. There was a time when baby Louise Brown was an anomaly as in vitro fertilization. Was she going to be normal or not? Now it's, every city has fertility clinics, and we view it as almost a right, not just something that's beneficial. And so the idea of how we reproduce has been completely changed, and the cues we send others to attract them, whether it's through perfumes or through Match.com, has changed the way in which you find and mate with people as never before. And then with regard to just having birth itself, cesarean sections range from 10 to 90% of all births in different parts of the world. Cesarean sections 100 years ago, or before anesthetic, were absolutely certain for the mother to die if she didn't deliver the 10th month.
But as you discussed, that the numbers of those have changed significantly. Why is that important? Because of the microbiome particularly, and a lot of the things that we get differently depending on how this particular mechanism through which we're born, which is another shift.
The other piece of it is there are genes getting passed on. For example, from people whose kids would not have survived. Genes are getting passed on as a result of the cesarean sections.
Okay. And now one more question before I let Joanne in this time. This is one I always ask when we're talking with people about cells, because it's relatively recently that I read and learned about what seemed to me the shift from the idea that genes control traits to the idea that's much more interesting, that genes control development and that traits are an emergent property of development. Help me see the importance and where it fits into the narrative of our current understanding of what we did with developmental biology and the discoveries with Evo and those sorts of things, which from my perspective as a physicist seem to have shifted a lot of things to a much more productive angle than had been before, of a very naive understanding of how genes affect what we are.
So the genetic basis of development, in other words, going from a single fertilized egg to an adult or even an adolescent, is not very well understood in terms of actual observations in human biology. We cannot experiment on humans for obvious reasons, nor can we intervene. So most of the information we glean is from extreme anomalies, which rare inborn genetic events, or from animal studies. What the animal studies are starting to show is things that happen to your parents or happen in utero alter the genetic programs that lead to the development of the brain or the organs or any of the other tissues in ways that are expected or unexpected. Perhaps the most startling are all of the genetic pathways that are turned on and off as the brain is developing in utero and shortly thereafter. How little we understand about that. So things like memory, like intelligence, like coordination, all of these behaviors have a basis originally in terms of the way in which the brain develops. During this period, there can be events related to diet, related to environmental toxins, related to perfect weather or bounty of food to eat that can influence the way those genetic programs are actually acting and changing. So today we're starting to see correlative studies, which is all we can do in humans, where you look at the parents' genetic DNA and the babies, and then you look at outcomes in children, and you say, is there a phenomenon that's correlated? It can't be causal, and it's largely based on what people have actually literally observed in studies of rodents. So the most recent one that I'm excited about, simply because it begins to draw a mechanism, is autism is out there with more than 20 different causes, genetic, environmental, everything. And for me, that simply means we don't know the cause. There's no single cause. Let's imagine that they're all right, but how do you actually say, how does this all work? How do you actually have something that leads to this autistic trait? And this paper that came out of Johns Hopkins a couple of weeks ago by Andy Feinberg and his lab showed that the sperm of fathers had a epigenetic signature that correlated with autism in children 4 years to 7 years later.
Interesting.
And so, in the epigenetic signature is something that occurs through environmental cues that have been placed on the father during his growing up until he actually conceived the child.
And just to gloss that, the epigenetic effects are the segments of the so-called junk parts of the DNA that are now we see as the switches that determine when proteins get expressed and how they get expressed and in what situations they get expressed. Is that about right?
That's right. They're on and off switches. There's about 19,000 genes, but there's 20 million on and off switches on those genes. And so imagine that if your parents or you in utero are in an environment of a drought or a famine, all the switches to grow big and have a rapid metabolism are going to be flipped off, because evolutionarily that makes sense. If you're coming into a period of time where there's an infectious disease problem, all your genes for the immune activation are probably turned on. So the baby is coming out with the right traits that allow it to be better developed. And a lot of the things in the book are about what does the body do with unnatural environments that we have created in trying to figure out which switches to flip.
Yep. And I think, when I look at the book, I see sort of two things. And one is this track where essentially an environmental mismatch to what, our bodies were originally evolved to do. So things like our diet, our level of activity, the types of activity we engage in, things like C-sections or taking drugs, like are these going to have long-term implications, consequences, right, for humans in general, and will we adapt, and will this adaptation even enter into the actual genome, like into the actual sequence, or will it always be an epigenetic thing, right? So that's one half of the book, these sort of consequences of the way we live our lives thanks to agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, and so forth, the pharmaceutical revolution. Then the other half of the book I see, even though you've blended the book all together, the other half I see is sort of the technologies we've come up with that can change either the genome or change our brains, change the way our body functions through different technologies. So, I thought that was really interesting. I mean, this book is comprehensive in its scope, and so I thought it was interesting. And then, so, you just talked about epigenetics, and we're talking about C-sections and changing the microbiome. These are things that we are unintentionally doing to ourselves, and we don't know what that's going to do to us as a species, right?
Right now, you're absolutely right. And when you say the book is comprehensive, I should be clear to people who haven't read it. The chapters are very short and very readable.
They are. That's right.
By millennials, because my kids have read it, and in fact, they had a moment keeping the chapters short. Their attention spans are not infinitely long. So the comprehensive part is the range of topics, and my mother's actually read many of the chapters in random order, because you can go from robots to pregnancy with fun. But in terms of the two styles where we're trying to explain the world as it exists today, in terms of the unexplained phenomena like allergies, like autism, and all the things that are going on around us, while pretending that we as a species have not changed in the last 200, 300, 1,000 years, despite all of these changes. If you go back to Darwin's finches in the Galapagos, 1 year of a drought is sufficient to change the beak shapes and strength of 10% of the finches. And that's just 1 year of a drought. Now take industrialized cities with our modern diets and our modern drugs and our modern everything, and say, how would the finch have behaved to that? And then to say, well, we have the same biology. Of course, we're going to have a variety of adjustments in ourselves. The latter half of the book is more about the tools are getting more powerful. The 20th century was a century where the dominant language went from 26 letters in the American alphabet to ones and zeros. All knowledge and information was suddenly transmitted as a result of just going to a ones and zeros. And on top of that, the wealth of nations, the wealth of individuals, the way that art is looked at, everything was completely transformed. Juan and I, our view is the 21st century is the century of GATC, the 4 bases of genetic code. You now have tools and instruments for modifying cells in ways that were unfathomable 100 years ago. And that we're starting to take advantage of that in ways that people had not anticipated, with gene therapy and other things. So this new century, our view is, as it will exit with biology having been the dominant player, with the help of many physicists along the way. And
thank you.
GATs have become the dialogue through which we transmit information and wealth and well-being and everything else.
So it looks like your light bulb went out on something.
I'll flop it back on. All right, there we go. My computer went to sleep.
Oh, so it provides a lot of light for your thing. So that's funny. So I was here at University of Illinois. I was an advisor for the iGEM team for a few years. And this team is, for those of you who don't know, this is a synthetic biology competition. It is the premier scientific synthetic biology competition. And this the students need to come up with an idea. If we could guide the evolution and the expression and the activities of organisms at the genetic level, how would we do that? And they go about doing that. Now they start small with just microorganisms. Usually bacteria is a good place to start because they're easy to manipulate. And they take little pieces, right? And they stick pieces of DNA in. These little bio bricks is what they call them. They stick them in and hope that, they either design them or they get them from a bank we have of those. And they say, well, okay, we want our bacteria to not only recognize there's arsenic in water, but then also to, figure out a way how to sequester that and get it out of the water. Or, beyond many more things. I think any story you read on synthetic biology and iGEM, you're going to read some fantastic stories, about how to make beer healthier and how to do all sorts of things. So synthetic biology is one of those things where, it's great fun to play with. It's a great tool for thinking ahead and, wondering how can we improve the world, but it also raises ethical questions. So you approach some of these in the book.
Right. So let me just say something briefly about the field of synthetic biology. As you're pointing out, there's a group originally starting out of MIT, and I was with Ron Weiss yesterday, one of the leaders of the synthetic bio world, and their view is that this is the equivalent of Radio Shack building it kits and in small ham radio clubs of the last century. Is we're going to have teams that build living organisms with interesting and valuable functions, like smelling like bananas when your food's rotten in the refrigerator. So you can so there's a lot of interesting opportunities, and kids are really gravitating to it. And it says something about how easy it is. It's like putting little radios together. It's no more difficult than that, and it's about a language. With regard to the ethics, our book is really very optimistic, because I'm very optimistic, as is Juan. It's a little bit of a challenge sometimes to be optimistic, because the scientific literature when it comes to human health is largely about studying diseases and problems. So it's a very short list of papers when I go look up the genetic basis of happiness or the genetic basis of being a great basketball player or something else, because you get funded to do those kinds of things. But nonetheless, people by and large, whether it was Ron Weiss's lab or others, are looking for ways to modify cells to make our life better and easier and safer in a lot of meaningful ways. With regard to the ethics, it's an active and important conversation. The recent moratorium around engineering germ cells with genetic engineering techniques with CRISPR has brought it to the front pages of the paper. And this is going to continue for the next 30, 40 years, because the technologies are getting easier, they're getting faster. In fact, there are going to be recipes on the internet, there probably are already, to modify genetically almost anything you want. But meanwhile, we have in place, as a nation and as a world, ethical standards that have been created by a number of national bodies, international bodies, about what to do and what not to do. But now is the time to have those conversations. Prior to now, they've been largely fictional when it comes to designer babies. They've been a little hyped up when it comes to discussions of GMO foods. And so now we understand that we want to use these technologies to improve human health. Genetic engineering and genetic therapy is now approved in Europe, not yet in the US, and in China. In fact, the first the first gene therapy was approved in Europe where it's not legal to eat genetically modified or sell genetically modified food, but you
I always found that interesting.
can genetically modify people. So we found a loophole. You can genetically modify things that are beneficial to children.
Just not a field of corn, or yeah.
But one area that we have forbidden in all international discussion is tinkering with the next generation.
Right.
So far, which is the germ cells, the sperm and eggs. But that dialogue needs to be had, because we now have the first birth. We have birth of a child in England with 3 parents,
right,
with the mitochondrial DNA. So it's not fiction. It actually is possible to tinker with the DNA of a newborn, so the future generations are altered. And that's something where I'm having conversations with people, and we hope it emerges as a useful and valuable debate. As an optimist, they say we've learned to regulate many bad things in our history, and I think we'll do the same here.
right. I think I always think of more extreme examples of things, like when trains first came around, passengers, people were like, "Oh my gosh, humans weren't meant to go that fast," and what was it? There's that surgery. Oh, once we start putting people to sleep, we'll be stealing all their organs, and you know what I mean? Giving them
anesthetics were originally thought to be against the Creator's will too, since he had invented pain and original sin. Women could enjoy it. There's behind the ethical issues, there are some things. What are the sources for those, and how many of those will dissipate or just be overtaken by events, if you want to guess? Are all of those something that could lead to something dangerous that we see to happen, like Frankencorn taking over the world accidentally and bugs escaping? How much of it is, well, I sound negative, but I'm an atheist, religious hysteria? How much it is just unfamiliarity with what's going on, and we always have a fear of the unknown.
Right.
I can understand that there's things, and I almost want to say, what are the real ethical issues, as though some of these are not real, and of course they're real for many people, but it's a complicated thing, and not all of it seems terribly useful to me to talk about.
Right, and right now it's with regard to humans, we can certainly do a lot of things with bacteria or even small animals. Humans, we're still in a safe territory with regard to our concerns, because these things have not been deemed universally safe. Some gene therapy has, but the committees that are part of the regulatory approval are saying nothing in germ cells, nothing in sperm and eggs is allowed. It must be for disease purposes, not for enhancement. Well, the slippery slope begins when it becomes 100% safe. Let's just take that as a simple assumption. And in fact, most people in the field are saying something about it will become completely safe. And it becomes inexpensive and easy to use. Now, do we define enhancement as someone's overweight and losing weight? Is that a disease or an enhancement? And it's actually been debated. It has implications for insurance coverage and everything else. So imagine that if you actually had a gene that would allow you to age more slowly, so you were less of a burden on the healthcare system. And the other twist of the ethical discussion has really come up in the recent measles debate, where in 1960, or 63, I think the first vaccine came out. Before that, it was an act of God whether you got the measles and potentially died or had brain damage. You had no control. That's the way Alzheimer's is today. That's the way an awful lot of things are today. And so now we have a debate where people who choose not to get it are coming under society pressure to have it.
Mm-hmm.
Now imagine if we had something that's going to prevent your Alzheimer's or keep you young or losing weight, and someone said, I don't want it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So it's not a life or death scenario there, but suddenly you're starting to see, wow, these conversations are important to have today because they have
Mm-hmm.
implications.
You know, I want to move on to the most interesting chapter to me was the last one about space, about, you know, what are our possibilities as humans going into space, and, you know, should we sort of pre-engineer a human that can withstand radiation or different things, you know, can we actually tinker? I mean, this is looking way in the future, and we just recently spoke to an astronomer who talked about the technologies for going into space, but I thought this was interesting to, you know, look at the extreme biology, you know, and the modifications we could consider, or possibly, you know, what if we send up a, you know, a printer that can print out DNA and get some species begun out in space. I was like, wow, my mind is blown. I haven't been reading enough science fiction lately, I think.
The thing I should point out is the futuristic stuff is not whether it's possible. Largely everything we describe is possible within existing scientific concepts and methods. But humans are evolving. I mean, one theory would be that we've reached the absolute ultimate of all of human evolution, and therefore Howard Stern and Rush Limbaugh represent the pinnacle of life, and we shouldn't move along any farther. Or that we've actually are continuing to change in response to the environment around us and our ability to actually take control, which is the thesis of the book, and control our own environment and those of other species around us. Now, in terms of space, there have been already 5 cataclysmic wipeouts of life on Earth in the past. There's a recent book called The Sixth Extinction, which...
Love that book. Won the Pulitzer, everybody.
Right. It's a great book. And it really says, you know, we are headed, and we say this in the book, to another cataclysmic event, and will humans survive? So if one route to survival, of course, is maybe there's a moral imperative to get humanity onto another living body, another, you know, a moon or another planet or something else. But to survive there, we can't count on good old-fashioned Darwinian natural selection and random mutation. That's not going to work in the time that we need to go survive in a different atmosphere or even create an atmosphere or something else. And so the idea is, if we could engineer ourselves, which we're not too far from, what would we do to enhance our ability to live in a spaceship, to sustain lots of radiation and without any problems, to maybe increase or decrease the rate at which we age, and all sorts of things, as a way in which we will continue humanity's survival in the universe. And there are lots and lots of thoughts about that. There are even experiments being done, as you pointed out, the idea of actually having a coded DNA sequence, sending a DNA printer to another planet, and then actually setting up, you know, 1,000 years later, or 5,000, or 100, 300,000 years later, depending how long it takes that printer to get there, instructions from humanity here of what should be made when it gets there, and then just printing out the species you got, or the species, and then solve for several. Make oxygen from certain aerobes, etc. So I think there's a lot of, it sounds science fiction-y, but people are actually thinking about this today.
That's really interesting. I wonder if Elon Musk is up for some CRISPR gene editing to become radiation, because he's willing to go to Mars, you know. So
yeah, no, we hear there's a book in the works for this summer about that, so you may want to pay attention to that.
Ooh, I have to keep my eye open for that one. It's very fascinating. And then, you know, that's the thing. I feel like somewhere towards the end of the book you had a little paragraph about all the things you talked about in the book, and I wanted to read that so our guests could get an idea of, our audience could get an idea of what all you cover. You talk about optogenetics, where you use light to help neurons communicate with each other in different ways, or in the case of injury, you talk about memory uploads, like, where we take it from a different brain. Could it come from a computer? You talked about so many things in this book. I was like, wow, the title, I couldn't even propose a separate title for you. But I felt like you needed something grander even to show what all is in this book. So
I may have a quotation from near there, Joanne, because I'm always looking for the part of the book where the author makes it easy and tells me what the book was about. And all the way on page 260, you wrote, what we wanted to do in this book was to open a dialogue with you, the reader. We have asked you to consider a range of topics, including chemistry, ethics, genomics, religion, robots, politics, behavior, space travel, and the future of humanity. In that spirit, how would you answer the question Juan asked at a recent TED conference, quoting, if you could redesign humans, what changes would you want archaeologists to find in 100,000 years? And that was really what you were doing, was looking at all the ways that we can affect development, and what humans are and what humans are becoming was the way it struck me. And so Joanne and I both agreed, it's like, we'd like a bigger title, but we haven't thought of one yet.
Well, if you come up with one, let us know.
Yeah, we sure will. And Joanne says, oh, maybe her favorite chapter was that one, which I like, but I was real hard pressed to name a favorite chapter. I think I found something interesting in each fairly short, digestible chapter with all of its fabulous references. Your references are very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
What was I just going to ask? Something. So there were rather few specific questions that I wrote down because there were so many big topics as such. But one that I wrote down, and it's partly rhetorical for anyone who might be listening, is why is there only one species of human right now on the Earth? Why is that odd, and is it going to stay that way?
Right.
Well, it's odd only in a historical context that there have been, ever since hominids and then hominins, which represents humans without the apes, arrived on this planet, there were always more than one, and generally a half a dozen that survive. If we keep finding skeletons in Africa and even elsewhere over and over and over. And so if you look at most species, there are niches that are get occupied by individuals who have traits that actually are most beneficial for a particular area.
And you're talking hominin species who were contemporaries, who lived at the same time.
Absolutely. So the Neanderthals are the most obvious. You have Artie, you have the Denisovans. There's a number that are being discovered or have been discovered. In fact, it raises the question, are they different species? You and I, like all humanity, is 99.9% identical. There's just 0.1% difference. There's just 0.2% difference between us and Neanderthals.
Mm-hmm.
And so at what point you become a new species? We could interbreed. There's significant evidence of that. And so what do you have to do? We look very different anatomically, but in terms of speech and other things, as contemporaries, it may have been that we were very much more alike than we like to believe today.
Mm-hmm.
And looking ahead, as we look at having these new tools, and we see even potentially sub-niches, take Mars or take an island, and people now can begin to repair disease traits, maybe live longer in a rogue state, as it were, right now. Will we actually partition ourselves into isolated groups with differing traits? The general concern has been that we all become alike. We all get to be 6'5" with blonde hair and blue eyes, with muscles and everything else. But I'm more hopeful that there's going to be more diversity as we look forward. Right now, everybody's trying to be alike, but I think once things become safe and you actually say, you know what, I really do like having a little bit of a different, being a different person, you will see more diversity celebrated.
Well, and that's one largish, not quite theme of the book, right? Is that we've spent all these tens of thousands of years becoming more homogeneous, and now you're showing us ways that we can diverge without perhaps too much, well, obviously without too much geographical isolation,
Right.
but possibly through choice, which is interesting. And so I think some people misunderstand that you're not claiming that we have been evolving ourselves, but that we're at a crux where these things
Right.
could start happening, or may be happening when we look back on them, but we don't know
I
it
think we
yet.
are evolving. I think evolving's a transition.
Mhm.
Nobody, even Darwin himself, could not define a species. It remains an undefined term.
Yes. And that's another thing that I would say the book is about. You get to the end of the book, and it's clear that we have no idea what a species actually is, even though we talk about it all the time.
And we can even debate what evolution is. And so when you go to the hologenome, you would say that, in fact, our hologenome, which represents our traits that we live with and are, survive and reproduce with, is evolving. If you embed it only in morphological traits, if you say it's about reproduction, then we have not evolved from Neanderthals, because we can interpret. So it's a very slippery definition that you deal with. So I would argue, just in the modern unnatural world that we live in of urban societies, we have evolved to have traits that would not put us in good stead if we were suddenly dumped into the rainforests or the jungles or wherever to survive. And it's not just because we were stupid and didn't know how to survive. We just don't have what it takes anymore in terms of the traits we're carrying.
That's right.
Well,
It was intriguing about how, if Darwin came today and saw you dropped him in Trafalgar Square, what would he be thinking about humans? What's happened to humans?
This comes up if you talk about survivalists or something too. There's an idea that some people have of, I don't know, a cultural metagenome or something. James Burke talked about this in his Connection series 40 years ago. He says, do you know if electricity stopped and society was thrown into chaos, could you go to this farm? Could you survive on this farm? Could you plant your own plants? Do you have any idea how to use this plow? What would you do to keep other people from coming and killing you and taking over the farm? And that's quite true.
And one of the things that is very interesting, and we don't highlight as much as we should, is what we consider back to nature, going to a farm, is 100% unnatural. There's nothing that humans decide exactly what lives on that piece of land. In terms of the animals, the plants, the insects, everything. So going really back to nature resembles nothing like that. In fact, the farmers are planting hybrid seeds that they can't even make themselves. They buy from a vendor. So the idea of really surviving in the real world is tough. One point I'd like to make about this, and this is something that I hope we can pass on to our kids, is we've now gone into an unnatural environment in terms of what humans are doing to the planet and to ourselves. That doesn't mean the entire planet has to be living by non-Darwinian rules going forward.
Right.
Juan and I would hope that the same way you put away aside nature preserves and everything else, we cannot ensure every species will survive. It's part of evolution that things go extinct, etc. But there should be a half of the planet that can live by the Darwinian rules that got us here.
I
could preserve it.
That's an interesting point. And actually, I was just saying, you keep mentioning Juan, and I want to, I think as part of our mission here, we like to talk about how do you do what you do. So how did you and Juan get together and then decide to write a book and say, and of course Juan's all over TED and you're on TED Talks, and so a very important part of what you are doing is communicating the science you are studying and contemplating and thinking about and helping others do.
Right.
So let's back up and talk a little bit about how you and Juan came together, and then how you guys made it your mission that we want to tell the world about this.
Right. Over 10 years ago, maybe closer to 15 now, Juan and I were both faculty members at Harvard. He was at the business school, I was at the medical school. He was focusing on life sciences and the economic implications of the genomics revolution. And I was working in genomics with sequencing and everything else. But we kept bumping into people who said, you two think and talk a lot alike about big concepts. And so eventually we ended up it's a little complicated. We ended up leaving and actually sharing an office right after we left Harvard, looking at small companies from an entrepreneurial perspective, but chatting all the time about the big ideas. And so we eventually went on to found a venture firm because we wanted to have a pot of money so our smart friends could help. We could help their ideas move forward and help humanity, bring new antibiotics out and new therapies for cancer and new biofuel, algae, things like that. And we've been doing that. That's our day job. We also sit, and I regularly go see scientists, as does Juan, who are big thinkers and really creating things that will impact the world in 20, 30, 40 years. And when it came time to write the book, Juan's a spectacular writer and a very natural communicator. I'm kind of stuck being a scientist where you live within the boundaries of what you absolutely observed and measured.
Yeah.
You can't speculate. Well, if it was in worms, you can't speculate it must be in humans.
Right.
If I'm taking someone out to lunch next week, and you say, why are you contacting me? I said, I want to know you to speculate what your worm data means for humans. And so when we put the book together and we write it, it's very much a readable text because Juan is a communicator and knows how to talk to people. I have a lot of experience talking to lay audiences, but we're talking about complex science being reduced to a level that my mother can understand.
Right.
And that's what we try to make work. At the same time, the science has to be credible. One of the things I learned in writing this is most science books are written by journalists who are not themselves practicing scientists. I've been a scientist for many years. I can speak the science language. And so I didn't know that. So there's some new theories or concepts in the book. The idea of 4 genomes and a hologenome is a new concept. The idea of a domesticated human is a new concept. You don't see they make sense. That is new for scientists who are enjoying the book. It's also new. It's not known to be new to lay readers, and Juan and I seamlessly, by going back and forth, iterate it in a way that it appears to be easy to read and understandable while being scientifically credible. And that's what it comes down to. It's this iterative process.
I've been thinking of that as I read and evaluate the books that we read, because I just can't help it. The ones that I value, and I'll give you high marks for that, is I don't think I mind the necessary abstraction and sort of averaging over of some things in order to talk about big ideas at a level that more people can approach, as long as it's done with the right care and precision so that you don't say anything that misleads the naive reader, because I think that's sort of the most egregious mistake. And so if you can do that with precision without being misleading, that's the world's best thing. And I didn't find anything. A couple points where I may wonder, but I'm not a biologist either, but I didn't find anything that offended my sensibility that struck me that you were misleading or anything. So I think that's very well done, and that's my main criterion for popular science, I think.
Well, good. Well, we haven't had any complaints yet from any of the scientists we cite in it, so we'll see how that works out. Hopefully it'll remain that way.
One thing you said, though, it's like, so you go out and you talk to scientists about their worms and things. Why do you do that? Is that part of the venture capital picture, or was that part of your gathering this information because you're a conduit for these things?
It's my hobby to begin with. I start every morning for 30 minutes. I go see what's new in the news. I mean, the hottest news for me the last week was they found the epigenetic on switch in a cell. But that's where I want to take someone out to lunch. I want to say, oh my God, I was predicting it a few years ago because it said there has to be one. I was asking scientists, and they were living within their four boundaries of what we know. And here it finally emerges, just because from an evolutionary perspective it makes sense. But so I just see something like that in some of the literature that comes over the internet, and I just get on it and say, and now I have a venue because the book is non-threatening to scientists. If I'm a venture capitalist, they say, oh, he's going to steal all my ideas and everything, which isn't true, by the way. But, but I help people think about how their ideas can translate into a bigger context, into even a way to help humans with diseases or other things.
Right.
And that's just very natural. It's the same for Juan. We have a lot of dinners with innovative thinkers, and we like to bring people together. It's the old salon style of the 19th century.
So do you, let me ask first, Jeff, just real quick.
Go ahead.
So do you do, what's going on here? Do you do really well in Nobel Prize guessing polls? You talk to so many innovative people. I'm just curious.
In terms of timing, no, but in terms of knowing what's coming, pretty well.
That's good.
We're very good friends with the individual, Erling Norby, who is the individual who made the calls to the Nobel laureates for many years. And he was in town about 6 months ago. And it's so funny to hear his stories about how nobody ever believes it when they get the phone call. So.
Even like Yamanaka, because everybody for years and years said, "Oh, Yamanaka, he's got to get it. He's got to get this, right?" And so, for those who are watching, Yamanaka was the one who was able to induce pluripotency from already differentiated cells.
Absolutely. Yeah. It still comes as a shock, and there's a lot of good stories, but. In terms of picking that, because those are single individuals, picking fields and areas that are going to be transformative. We were writing about CRISPR, a year and a half ago for the book. Now it's everywhere, and we see the most interesting thing about the book in terms of what I've seen in the last 5 years is 5 years ago, the New York Times or any media outlet on Google or anything that had an article about science, about once a month had an article that would have been cited in our book. Now it's several a day. And it's because we're now having dialogues about the concepts that are in the book.
Right. Something that you mentioned when you were just now in passing, talking to scientists and helping them see how they can help people. Yeah. When we were talking recently with people about the genetic basis of cancer and possible therapies and things, one question that I had for them was, I was thinking back to the days, and I was even old enough to know it, when Nixon declared war on cancer. And my question then for them was, did it make sense to declare war on something where you didn't understand the enemy yet? And what you just said made me think, all of this new understanding about the genome, the epigenome, all these other things that are going on, how these connect with diseases and things, has our understanding changed profoundly enough now in the next last 20 years that we're seeing new insights. We're getting new insights, right, into how we can go about finding therapies for some really pretty serious diseases.
You're going to see a transformative, enormous change in the therapies for cancer in the next 5 years. What is that? The idea that we overestimated the genome in the early going and have underestimated it now couldn't be more true, because I'm seeing them firsthand. Small companies, these early stage IPOs, and it's really third generation technologies where we've gone from just doing simple things, taking what nature made. Take insulin and give it to a diabetic, that works, but take an interferon and give it to somebody with hepatitis, it doesn't cure them. They die from the interferon.
Right.
And so,
whoops.
I think it's just a brief dropout, but we'll find out.
Yep, soon enough. So could be. Like I noticed, I needed to plug in my computer.
Yes, and sometimes the internet dances to its own mysterious tunes.
That's true. That is so true. Well, we'll see if he gets back on. And
That's right.
We've had all sorts of things. I remember Lucy Cook when she was talking about her sloth book and her sloth videos, and her laptop ran completely out of battery. Yeah.
Yes, the technology problems have been there, and now I'm thinking about all these questions that I get to ask people from show to show and start making connections, and all of these microbiology people we've been talking to, Joanne, I'm learning so much from, and I'm very excited at the things that we've learned in the last 20 years that were new questions that came up that were so different from what we thought were the questions when I was a youngster, where, thinking back to an earlier one even, where everything was about how how different parts of the
Back.
body
Sorry.
itself. Stephen's back. Great.
Yay, yay. Well, we
Sorry.
just had an opportunity to reminisce about various technological issues that have
No
happened.
problem.
They happen. That's fine, you know.
Oh, they do.
Okay.
We're pioneers. That's what it is. And you were saying something really fascinating. Can you remember?
No, I can't remember. So.
Well, we were talking about the advance in understanding and how this is now moving down to therapies, some really exciting therapies.
Oh yeah, so the cancer therapies are coming fast and furious, and a little bit of the X Prize kind of mentality seems to be creeping into it, that we actually have things, and the IPO market's heated up. So there are, well, declaring war on cancer is nice. If the time is not right and the incentives are misaligned, it would never happen. Now we actually are seeing orphan diseases and cancer having huge breakthroughs in terms of how we're doing it. And what it comes down to is understanding it, but more importantly today, now that we've begun to understand it, is targeting specific cells. The therapies we're seeing now are non-toxic to healthy people because they only kill cancers.
And the difference being that there's been decades now of fundamental research that means we can actually understand enough of what we're doing to do something by design.
So yeah, there's a technology we're associated with where they take human antibodies that can specifically bind to a tumor cell, and they link directly to it a toxin that causes food poisoning from it's called Shiga toxin. And so we know that kills human cells, but now you've actually set it up so it only kills cancer cells. And if you give it to somebody who doesn't have those cancer cells, it does nothing.
Doesn't work. That's amazing. And
it's an example of a variety of things. We're now harnessing the immune system. You're seeing that. So there's a lot coming, and I think it will translate into other areas. But those are the first two. In orphan diseases with gene therapy is going to be revolutionary, absolutely revolutionary.
Amazing. It's just incredible. And your book, I think, could open the eyes of many people to some of these technologies. You know, even if what you were writing about it was a year ago, this could bring people up to speed. And then maybe when they're looking at the news, they'll start seeing some of these grand technologies that offer a lot of promise.
Absolutely. And I'm hoping that the book, because it gives some overarching ideas about how to think about all these things. You don't think about them in isolation. You have a working framework to understand what does this mean when you talk about CRISPR? What does this mean when you talk about the measles? What does this mean about all of these things for me and my grandkids?
Right. Right, and my job at the university, one of the things I do is to teach teachers who are getting their masters in teaching biology. And so, you know, I feel like part of my role, it is so important to say, what I'm going to teach you, these cutting edge things in biology, you need to know because your students need to know, because they need to know and their kids need to know. And, you know, this is so important. So, yes, it's good to know the chambers of the heart and things like that as a base, but we really need to be looking at things that are going to affect your life directly. You know, or the kids you teach, their lives. So I think it's very admirable. We are at the top of the hour. I want to thank Steve so much for joining us. Is there anything else you would like to add before we sign off?
This is the free form time when you get to do what we didn't ask.
So my other, in addition to science, my other passion is mentoring young scientists and scientists to be. And so, you know, I've done many walk-arounds around MIT, and I'm willing to do anything on the internet just because I love to teach. And I really want to applaud you and thank you because that's submission you are absolutely dedicated to and actively involved in, is communicating that science is alive, science is about people. If you walk around the Harvard Meds area with me, if you think you're a geeky young 14-year-old, which you'll see 15,000 people who were just like you about 20 years ago, and we all love talking the same language, and it's really a fun language to get to know and to be part of, and lay people can appreciate it when you bring it into a humorous context like we do in the book.
That's, you know, that's amazing, and Jeff and I always offer We say now you're part of the Read Science family, and we try to keep an eye on what you're doing, and we'll help you promote whatever you are up to. So if you are out there supporting young scientists, well, we're there with you.
Right.
So don't ever hesitate to send us a little note telling us what you're up to, because we'd be happy to share. So. So everybody, it's top of the hour. We've had a great hour with Dr. Steve Gullans talking about his book, Evolving Ourselves, co-authored with Juan Enriquez. This book is, if you want to know what the latest and greatest technologies are for improving ourselves in all sorts of ways, and we didn't even talk about sports and things like that that are in this book. This is a great book to read. Chapters are short. Yes, you could just put it on your coffee table and flip through and choose a chapter and read it now and again. That'd be great. So, see, now I've got an idea for you. Make it into a coffee table book with some of the photos of some of these technologies. You know, big coffee table, and you could put.
We know some good photographers. So.
Oh, we do. I could think of some great ones. Oh my goodness.
And illustrators, yeah.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
true.
That's
what, when we do Read Science, we like to say, oh, you have a photographer and an illustrator, and we like to bring everybody in, because it's all towards the goal of communicating science, and we appreciate what you do, Steve.
Fabulous.
And wonderful. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you, Steve, and we will sign off.
Bye, Joanne. Bye, Jeff.
Bye, Steve.